Have you ever wanted to know the best practices when creating a data model? Have you ever missed some data relationships in your data model? In this video, Jesse Twum-Boafo is discussing top 5 tips when creating a data model which will support you in your learning journey. Welcome! It's Rachel and Jessica from 100 Days at Trailhead, the place where the tech community comes to learn Salesforce, learn tech, get inspired, have fun, and invest in ourselves. Whether you are brand new to learning Salesforce and starting from the beginning, or mid-career and skilling up for that new opportunity, we are your trail guides here to support you with an itinerary to help you get where you're going. You are in the right place. If you are new to our channel, make sure you hit the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to click on the notification bell so you can be notified when we release a new video. In the description below, you can find links on everything we mention in this video, in addition to links we find helpful like books that have helped us and our friends along our tech and Salesforce journeys. To find other helpful Salesforce and tech content, visit our blog at 100daysoftrailhead.com. In this video, Jesse Twum-Boafo is discussing the top data modeling tips which will assist you in documenting the relationship of your org's data to leverage in order to build better solutions. Jesse is a Salesforce architect with more than 5 years' experience implementing solutions across various Salesforce clouds. He has experience working across multiple for-profit and non-profit industries and sectors. Jesse is currently on the journey to CTA. Your quest, should you choose to take it, is to journey with us through the adventure of learning data modeling. Your quest begins now.
My name is Jesse Twum-Boafo, and I'm a Salesforce Solutions Architect. Today, we'll be talking about my top 5 tips when data modeling. Enjoy. Okay, so let's talk about the top 5 things you need to know about data modeling. Tip number 1. Design for success. What I've tried to do throughout all these tips is for us to use a particular data model. It'll just help us to understand what we need to go through. But the first tip is design for success. When you think about the actual data model that you're working on, it's important to not just think about today and what makes sense in the context of today, but think about tomorrow. Think about what if what you've designed leads them to success? What if it takes them to the next level? Then does your data model make sense at that point in time, or does it need to adapt? Do you need to think about a different way to do something? So if we look on the right-hand side here, we see a typical data model that would be used for tracking attendance at a school or some kind of education data model. And if we look at the attendance object in particular, let's think about the context in which we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cohorts, or a very small number of participants, really. In that case, we have a few attendance records that get generated over time. And then it really is okay. We can store that in Salesforce and we can have that there the whole time. But what happens if the organization that does this is actually successful? What if they have hundreds of participants in the program, attending classes daily, having daily sessions? Then all of a sudden you have thousands and quickly millions of attendance records. And then actually you probably want to have some way of moving that data off of Salesforce. Maybe you need to think about your automation. Does it still make sense to update your attendance records in the way that you would in that sense? And we'll look at that in a little bit later. But the point is thinking about success and what things will look like when you're successful is a great way to think about ways in which your data model or points in your data model that you need to be worried about. So it'll more accurately allow you to think about scale. And scale is not just data volumes, it's automation. It comes across the board. There are many areas. So think about success as a criteria. Number 2, embrace the constraints. So a very wonderful saying that I've heard a couple of times is Salesforce is a constrained platform. And that's something that's said as a positive, not a negative. Salesforce is a multi-tenant platform, and that means that we're all sharing the same resources amongst one another. And there's a good reason why we do that. So rather than thinking about that as a problem and trying to work around it in the short term, think about those constraints as being something that help you to make the right decisions. So again, if we think about our attendance object here, if we needed to update a particular field, the status field on our attendance object, we could use Process Builder. And Process Builder would easily make an update to one record, maybe a few records. But once we get a large number of records, Process Builder probably isn't the right thing. If we have over 150 records that we need to update at one go, then Process Builder would time out. We'd hit a DML limit. And so instead, maybe we need to go with flows, which would allow us to bulkify our records. Maybe we need to think about going with something asynchronously, because does it actually need to be synchronous? By thinking about our constraints and embracing the governor limits, it'll help us to avoid issues that might become problematic further down the line. So tip number 2 is embrace the constraints. Tip number 3, design with the end user in mind. So again, let's look at this data model, and for a second, let's ignore the relationship between the cohort and membership. So we have cohorts. Cohorts have many sessions. Each session has a group of members who are the participants, and similarly, each session has an attendance which tracks which participants came to the session. Now, ordinarily, we don't need to know which cohorts the members are a part of, but actually it'd be pretty nice as an end user if when you clicked onto the cohort, you could see a list of participants who belong to this particular cohort and see which participants should be attending sessions that are part of this cohort. So in this case, having that relationship is surplus to requirements if we think about it strictly. But from a user experience perspective, that relationship just makes for a nice list that we see from the cohort. Again, they're also reporting benefits to having that list there. Suddenly we can see a list of participants that belong to that cohort in a way that we wouldn't have been able to see without it. So it's not required. By no means does it impact the way that data would traverse our data model, but actually it's very helpful from the perspective of an end user and what their click stream could look like. So tip number 3 is think about the end user, have them in mind, because that could lead to some small tweaks that would make a world of a difference for them and would aid adoption. Tip number 4, think about sharing. So let's go a little bit deeper here in terms of the technicalities. So if we look on the left, we have the traditional decision point, master detail versus lookup. And in the example that we have here, we have orders that are being tracked in Salesforce, and the orders are related to an account. Now, if we go with the master detail as denoted by the solid line, that would mean that whoever owns the account record owns the order records. Now, that makes sense in some contexts and probably is the most straightforward way to think about it. Therefore, if you have access to the account record, you have access to all the order records. It's pretty simple. However, sometimes an order can be placed for an account, but might be placed by a different account. Maybe you have group accounts that are at play. Or maybe there's an ownership concern where somebody who owns the account should not necessarily be able to see the orders, in which case actually it makes sense to have a lookup instead. So here we have, in both scenarios, we have a one account to many orders that we want to cater to, but we need to think about sharing as a way to handle that. Now, that's probably your typical sharing requirement that you would think about, but it actually goes a little bit deeper. Let's consider the situation where you have two master detail relationships instead. So if we look at the participant, if we look at our education data model on the right-hand side again, we have a participant and we have a session. And actually, in this case, the session is owned by the cohort. Now, who should own the membership record? Should it be owned by the participant, or should it be owned by the person who owns the participant, or should it be owned by the person who owns the session? What happens in a world where you have teachers and you have social workers? The social workers are able to see more detail than and need to be able to see more detail than the teachers. So the teachers own the sessions and the cohorts because that's part of their stream of work, but the social workers own the participants. Should the social workers be able to see the memberships of the students, or should the social workers be able to see the membership of the students? Who manages that relationship? The primary master detail is what would drive that. So that's a very classic example of a decision that you'd want to think through. So think about sharing. It may drive the type of relationship that you would use in terms of master detail versus lookup, but it also determines which relationship you create first. Do you create the membership master detail to the participant, or do you create it master detail to the session first? Because that would be the primary master detail. So think about sharing. That's tip number 4. Tip number 5, and this came from a lot of experiences, a lot of enjoyment. Tip number 5 is do it together. One thing that I found over time is that we tend to go into our little corner and think about our data model, scribble on our little diagrams together on our own as we take the requirements that we've heard. But sometimes it's so beneficial to do the data modeling with your client, with whoever your stakeholder is. And it's beneficial for a couple of reasons. One of them is that it helps to, as you explain it to the client, they might learn a thing or two, and that helps them with adoption further down the line. They adopt it because they understand it. If you think about it, once you understand something, you're more likely to enjoy it. And this is true of every one of us. So from a purely adoption perspective, it's very helpful to do your data modeling together. The second part is that the discussion might also reveal deeper details about their process. So I've bumped into many a situation where terminology differs. What I call a case is different from what you call a case. What I call a service is different from what you call a service. Little differences in terminology like that can lead to very big differences in terms of the relationships that you create. But by doing it together, by showing what you think the relationship looks like between a case and a service, for example, might lead to them giving you some insights that help you shift around the relationships as you need to. And that's a very classic example. So by taking people on the journey, I believe that you help them you end up reaching a better destination because you help them to understand what needs to happen, and that helps from an adoption perspective, and you have a better understanding of their process, and that leads to you designing a data model that is more meaningful to them. So tip number 5 is do it together. And those are my 5 tips for data modeling.
And with that, we're at the end. How do you plan on using these tips to help you in your Salesforce org? What was your favorite tip? What do you want us to cover in future videos? Comment below. We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you've made it to this point, we want to take an opportunity to say thank you. Since you've stayed with us, here's a bonus. It's important to focus on the process. Let's watch as Jesse explains.
My bonus tip is focus on the process. This is a bonus tip, but perhaps the most meaningful tip that I've gotten in my life. By focusing on the process, you again are thinking about the way the data needs to flow through the system. If we think about our education data model, by thinking about the student and how the student interacts with the teacher, through the administrator, all the way to the principal and back, it helps us to think about how our records would be created. It helps us to think about which relationship needs to be the primary relationship from a master detail and a sharing perspective. It helps us to understand how records will enter the system, where we need to have concerns about data volumes and the means of data entry. And that's beneficial from a data modeling perspective and can help you with thinking about your user experience. So if anything, focus on the process and use that to drive the entirety of the data model.
Thank you for spending time with us. Make sure you like this video. It helps a lot. Click subscribe and on the notification bell so you never miss another video. We also handpick these videos which we recommend you watch next. You can talk to us on Instagram, Twitter, and on our website at 100daysoftrailhead.com, all of which are listed below. Thank you for learning with us, and we'll see you back tomorrow.